Hi, everyone. My name's Jenny Parker, and I'm the Chief Communications Officer at American Promise. And this is a new LinkedIn series we're doing called Behind the Headline. It can seem like the news about money and politics is never ending, and we really just have time to ingest it and maybe respond to it. This series is going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take a minute, pause, and take a look at how American elections have been changing over time. And we're going to do that largely under the context of a Supreme Court decision in the 1970s that changed so much about how money works in our elections. American Promise produces a lot of different type of content. We have a podcast, we produce our own original research, we write and place op-eds, and then we also do short social media videos that do respond to that breaking news. But to take a step back, we're going to do it a little bit differently here. And to help me put all of this into context and to talk about why it all matters, I'm joined by my colleague, Brian Boyle. Brian, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll get into what today's episode is about.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. It's great to see you. And thank you to anybody who might be viewing this out there on LinkedIn. So as Jenny mentioned, I'm Brian Boyle. I'm the Chief Program Officer and General Counsel here at American Promise. And really what that means is on the Chief Program side of things, I oversee our state and federal work, where we're working every day to mobilize support for a constitutional amendment that would address the role of money in politics. And then on the General Counsel side, I handle our everyday legal matters, but also that involves a lot of the sort of deeper legal thinking. It informs our amendment strategy. And so I think as part of this series, I'll be wearing both of those hats at different times. And I'm excited to bring you all deeper into the work we do here at American Promise.
All right, great, Brian. I'm so excited to be doing this with you. So today we're talking about the poll we recently commissioned. Working with Brian and with a polling firm, we conducted a national poll to basically see if Americans agree that unlimited spending in elections is a form of protected free speech. We released the poll this week. You can find the findings on the newsroom of our website. But I wanted to talk about the two top line findings and then also what surprised us both. The top line finding is that only 15% of Americans agree that unlimited spending is a form of free speech that should be protected by the First Amendment. That's pretty much shows just how out of step the Supreme Court is with most Americans when it comes to this issue. The other finding is that by 3-1, Americans want their elected officials in charge of the rules around money and politics. But Brian, here's what surprised me most about the findings was just how deeply cross-partisan they are. Mm-hmm. Across the board, Democrats, Republicans, and independents agree on all of this. It's not a partisan issue. I'd love to hear what you noticed.
Yeah, I mean, agree. It definitely isn't a partisan issue, and we see that reflected in the polling results over and over again, honestly. Even when other sources ask similar questions, the concern that Americans have about the role of elections is broadly shared, and it doesn't matter whether you're wearing a red hat or a blue hat or anything in between. You have the sense that this is working as it should. I would say that one of the findings from this poll that I don't know that it surprised me, but I think it's really important to have the data to share with everyone is just how few people understood what the Supreme Court's position on this is. Most people weren't even aware that the Supreme Court has equated unlimited spending in elections with the freedom of speech. Like that's just not dots that Americans had been connecting. And that is actually central to how we got to where we are. So I think it's great, shows what a teaching opportunity we have in American Promise to really expose how disconnected the Supreme Court's cases are from the way everyday Americans think about the freedom of speech.
Yeah, that surprised me too. It also was notable to me that when we informed them of the structure that we now live with, the support for having elected officials in charge of these rules went up. So I thought that was very interesting as well. So let's talk about Buckley versus Valeo, the Supreme Court case that we conducted this poll. We timed this poll to. It turns 50 this month. It's significant to me that it turns 50, just as America is turning 250. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But just super high level, what was this court case and what did it change about money and politics?
Great. Well, I am going to go super high level, and I'm actually going to go back. You mentioned America's 250th birthday coming up. So let's think 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence. This whole American experiment gets going. We have the Constitution comes around a little after a decade goes by. But really, for the first 200 years of American history, from 776 until 1976, decisions about the role of money in our campaigns and elections were left to the American people and their representative lawmakers to kind of hash out. Now, I want to be clear, like campaigns as we know them today just did not even exist back when the country was first founded. So they didn't have these big money fueled campaigns that are now like second nature to Americans today. But once campaigning became a thing, states and Congress were rules and were legislating in this area. They were trying to set guardrails over the role that money played in campaigns and elections. And that's sort of the trajectory up until 1976. And that 50 years ago this week was when the Supreme Court issued the key decision in this whole area. It's a case called Buckley versus Valeo. And Jenny, would it be helpful for me to go into a little bit of the background there? Or I don't want to lose our listeners with those details. But
I love the background. I think it's super interesting when people hear the names and the faces involved.
Okay. All right. So we have to think about what's sort of going on in the early 70s, right? There had been, heard of the Watergate scandal. There had been congressional investigations into that. Congress and policymakers saw that money was being involved in the political and electoral process on both sides in ways that they felt were really corruptive to the process. And so Congress stepped in and passed a comprehensive piece of legislation called the Federal Election Campaign Act. So I think it was first passed in 71 or 72, and then it was amended again in 74. So by the time we get to the decision I mentioned, Buckley versus Valeo, we're really looking at the 1974 version, which was this comprehensive scheme that set all sorts of rules around limits, transparency, disclosure, enforcement when it comes to the rules of money in politics. A couple other things to note. That legislation, that was bipartisan legislation that was signed into law by Republican presidents. And there were multiple expressions from the public and from lawmakers at the time that these laws were actually necessary to help restore Americans' confidence in their system of government, because they could tell that Americans were starting to feel that if money was kind of calling the tune and driving a lot of the decisions, then government was no longer truly representative to constituents and was much more responsive to the moneyed interests. So that was kind of the motivation. And again, it was a bipartisan piece of legislation. Plaintiffs challenged that law, and that was the case Buck versus Valeo. And as part of their challenge, one of the arguments that they made, really the key argument that they made, was that because modern campaigns require money to get your message out, right? Like you need to pay for ads, maybe radio, TV, whatever the case may be, because campaigns need money to help to fuel their campaign, that the court should essentially treat money as if it is speech itself. And Um, I think, let me just take one other point. This is also at a time in the 70s where the Supreme Court has gotten very, very, very active in freedom of speech cases more generally. And I'm talking about the types of free speech that most of us would think of as free speech, like your right to express a view publicly or speak up on your sidewalk. And so the Supreme Court was aggressively reviewing laws that infringe speech in those ways. But now all of a sudden, the argument was you should take the same really rigorous judicial review and apply it to campaign finance laws. And that was the key innovation of Buckley versus Valeo. And the court ultimately accepted that argument. And so since 1976, the court has applied very, very rigorous judicial scrutiny to any campaign finance law and has struck down most of them.
So I just want to bring up Citizens United in all of this, because when people talk about or they hear about money in politics, it's almost always in the context of Citizens United. Put Buckley in context of Citizens. How do we understand it?
Yeah. It's actually one of my little like personal pet peeves because people heard of Citizens United, but truly Buckley versus Valeo is the case that launched this entire theory where money should get the same treatment as will speech. It was in Buckley versus Valeo where the Supreme Court said you are not allowed to set any limit whatsoever on how much people spend in an election. And so not only can you have no limits or guardrails on how much a candidate or a campaign spends, but if an independent individual wants to take out ads supporting, you can't set any limits on how much they spend there. That was actually the Buckley case that decided that. Now that logic extended in Citizens United because there were corporations and nonprofits and unions that also wanted to spend unlimited amounts to influence elections. And in Citizens United, the Supreme Court said that they had a constitutional right to spend those unlimited amounts as well. So obviously, Citizens United was more recent. It was a 2010 decision, but Buckley was really the OG case in this area.
Okay, so Buckley got us started, but just to be really clear, when people hear money equals speech, that's not something that's always been in America. This was a very defined decision that happened. And from what you're saying, it says to me that it not just changed the rules around money in politics, it also changed how rules around money in politics are made.
Yeah, I think actually from a constitutional perspective, that point you just made, the who decides point, is probably the most important one. Because to be as fair as possible to the logic of the people who decided Buckley, they're actually, I mean, they're right that money is involved in campaigning, right? Money can help you get your message out. You can buy ads, you can get on radio, right? So everybody knows that money is involved in campaigning. But the problem is when the courts treat restrictions on money as if they are restrictions on speech itself, it means that courts become the ones that decide what kind of laws are okay and which ones aren't. And I just want to give you, if I could, a little bit of a sense of how kind of extreme this rhetoric actually is. I bet not too many of our listeners listen to Supreme Court oral arguments in their car ride, but I like to do that. But one of the things that's crazy is that if you listen to the Supreme Court justices or the oral arguments in these arguments talking about campaign money, they actually just use the word speech when they're actually talking about money. So somebody could say, oh, well, you're spending $250,000, but the person says, oh, I have more speech. I have the ability to have more speech, as if money is always speech. And it's like, campaigns spend money on lots of things. They spend money on consultants, they spend money on clothes, they spend money on meals, they spend money on staff, they spend money on research. Like there's all sorts of things that that money can be deployed to do. And it's not like it's all just going to like a little pamphlet that you're giving out to your constituents. But the way that they talk about it at the Supreme Court, it's like a one-to-one thing. Money is speech. And I think most Americans just know that that logically isn't true. Um, so I think that that's one of the things where if you give the decisional power back to lawmakers, it can bring a bit more common sense to this area, right? They all know they've run, they've
Yeah.
been candidates. They know that money isn't the same thing as, and they are just as capable as thinking through kind of the policy pros and cons. In fact, they're probably better at it than the unelected federal judges who are making the decisions now.
So, it also occurs to me that the other thing that feels out of step with the Buckley decision is the way it talks about corruption. I think for most people, when we think about money and corruption in politics, we're looking at like the whole ecosystem of how money could work. Access being perhaps top, then there's, influence and favors. Talk to us a little bit about how Buckley kind of, I don't know if we'd say redefined the word corruption, and what it left off the table as part of that redefinition.
Yeah, this is another really important area where I think the court's reasoning is disconnected from the way most Americans would think and the way the founders thought about corruption too. So the founders, like I think most Americans today, understood that corruption could take the form of individual corruption, right? Like obviously a bribe, a quid pro is a form of corruption, but you can also have more systemic corruption about influence and access and how that can thwart genuine representative government. When the Supreme Court really for the area of campaign finance, they said, we, the court, recognize only one form of corruption that we think you're allowed to legislate about. And it's just the quid pro quo, like I give you money and you get me a piece of legislation. That's the only form of corruption that they say you're allowed to try to target with a campaign finance law. So if I could just give like one quick example of a type of law that is worried about a different type that the Supreme Court says is not allowed. A lot of states are worried about the integrity of their electoral process and their state sovereignty. And they're worried about the role that outside money can play in interfering with that. Because if you have a system where unlimited amounts of money can flow in from parts of the country that are totally geographically disconnected from your constituency, obviously going to change the incentives of the people that are running for office, right? Because they're looking outside for the money rather than focusing on the constituents who are voting. So states have passed laws to try to set guardrails on that money that comes in from out of state. And those laws repeatedly invalidated by federal courts because the federal courts say, and there's this like really incredible language out of a case from Alaska where the court says Alaska's interest in protecting its system of self-government is not a valid interest. Like they're not allowed to pass a campaign finance law office because it's not quid pro quo corruption. And again, I think your average voter totally thinks of that as a corruption, or at least thinks it should be within the realm of possibility for policymakers to consider it corruptive.
That's pretty amazing. I almost wish we had measured Americans' definition of corruption as part of our poll, but there'll be future.
But it would have, should have.
Yeah, there's future polls. There's future polls to be had. So I just want to ask you, do you think that the court would ever reconsider its logic? Like, is that something that you see happening?
I don't see it happening anytime soon. We did file an amicus brief in a case in the Supreme Court where we we raised originalist arguments to suggest that the court's Buckley decision was wrongly decided, that it wasn't grounded in an original understanding of the First Amendment. And so we think it's worth making the justices aware of those arguments. And I think the same could be said for the founders' understanding of corruption. But at a more fundamental level, um, I actually think it's better for the country to not sit on its hands and hope for, justices to change their mind on this, because that just reinforces this idea that the only people that can explain or expound what the Constitution means are the justices. Like, that's actually not, again, how the founders thought. The founders thought we had a role in saying what the Constitution means. And if we as Americans today think the court has taken a wrong turn on money in politics, it's really healthy for us to be involved in an effort of putting a flag in the ground through a constitutional amendment where we make our constitutional understanding clear and binding on the court.
So, I mean, by that logic, if we had bought the Supreme Court's ruling on women in the vote, we'd all be still sitting around waiting for them to change their mind in some court case and give us the vote.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the thing is, there have been a number of times in history where the Supreme Court decided one way. Americans either thought that that decision was wrong or maybe a misinterpretation. And so they passed an amendment to set the rule right. And women's ability to vote is a great example of that.
So it's been 50 years since Buckley. What do you think is Americans' biggest misconception about the conversation around money and politics? And where should they be focused on instead as we move forward?
Hmm. Um, I, so I think the Americans' biggest misconception is that there's nothing we can do right now about this situation. Now, I think the Americans that have been part of our movement realize that that's not true. But I think it's so important for people to understand that the Constitution is amendable. Like, it's there for us. It's a tool that the founders gave to us for exactly these moments. And I'd say the other misconception is that people might not realize how quickly lawmakers are coming around to the idea of a constitutional solution. And so we need to just keep sharing that news with folks and helping them find ways to get their voice heard on this, because I think it's within our reach. I think it's within our ability to get this done. And I don't want people to succumb to any sense of resignation about, well, it's such a big lift. Well, yeah, it's a big lift and amending the Constitution should be, but we can totally do this. We can get this done.
Well, on that note, since this is our first episode, bring it all home for us. How does Buckley and this amendment solution, how does that intersect with what we here at American Promise are doing every day?
Yeah, so I'll just quickly flag that for the amendment itself, right? The language that we think would be best suited for this is language that really takes these decisions away and gives them back to the states and Congress. Our amendment is agnostic on what campaign finance policy there should be. It's more focused on who should decide. And so it would let the states debate things and decide and revisit and re-legislate and all of that. And the same thing with Congress. And really what that does is it gets the courts out of an inappropriate policymaking role that they've been in 50 years. It gives control back to the American people where it originally rested. And I think it also helps to restore a sense that I think Americans need right now, which is that our Constitution still belongs to us and that government can truly be representative of our interests if we're allowed to have the power to set guardrails on the way money flows through our campaigns and elections. So I hope that helps to connect the dots.
Great. Thanks so much for doing this with me, Brian. This has been a lot of fun. And thanks
Thanks,
everybody.
Jenny.
Yeah, it's been great. And thanks everybody for tuning in today. We have a next episode coming up. We're going to talk, or Brian's going to talk to us about federalism and how focusing on that principle changes the conversation about money and politics. So stay tuned here for that episode. And to learn more about American Promise, please visit americanpromise.net and learn more about our amendment there. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.